Invisible Sesame. On July 17, 2016, 15-year-old Natasha Ednan Laprousse arrived at Heathrow Airport with her father and friend for a dream vacation to Nice, France. Before boarding, she stopped at a Pret-a-Manger cafe in Terminal 5 and purchased an artichoke, olive, and tapenade baguette. Natasha had severe food allergies since childhood, particularly to sesame seeds. She checked the label carefully, as she had been taught to do all her life. No allergens were listed. As British Airways flight BA 342 took off, Natasha bit into her sandwich. Unknown to her, sesame seeds had been baked directly into the dough. They were invisible, unlisted, and lethal. Within minutes, red hives appeared on her neck and midriff. Natasha took 2 Puritan allergy tablets, hoping to stop the reaction. It wasn't enough. The symptoms escalated rapidly. Her father, Nadim, administered her EpiPen, injecting adrenaline into her thigh. The small cabin of the airplane became a desperate medical scene. Natasha's throat was closing. Each breath became more difficult than the last. At 35,000 feet, there was no way to land quickly. No hospital was within reach. A second EpiPen was used. It had little effect. Natasha's oxygen levels plummeted as her airways swelled shut. The cabin crew called for any doctors on board. A physician responded, but had limited medical supplies. Natasha lost consciousness as her body was starved of oxygen. The pilot issued an emergency alert requesting priority landing in Nice. For 40 minutes, Natasha's father performed CPR in the airplane aisle as other passengers watched in horror. When the plane finally landed, French paramedics rushed aboard. They continued resuscitation attempts, but Natasha's brain had been without oxygen too long. At a hospital in Nice, doctors pronounced Natasha Ednan Laprousse dead. The cause? Anaphylactic shock from undeclared sesame. Her death sparked outrage across the UK, revealing that food regulations allowed allergens to go unlisted if ingredients were added during the production process. In 2021, Natasha's law was enacted, requiring full ingredient labeling on all prepackaged foods in the United Kingdom. Murder over coffee. On January 6, 2016, a 27-year-old Indonesian woman, Wayan Mirna Salihin, met her friends at Olivier Cafe in Grand Indonesia Shopping Mall in Jakarta. Mirna, a newlywed who had recently returned from a honeymoon, was looking forward to catching up with college friends Jessica Kumala-Wongso and Hani. Jessica arrived first and ordered a Vietnamese iced coffee for Mirna, before the others reached the cafe. When Mirna arrived, the coffee was waiting. Security cameras captured the moment as she took her first sip. Immediately, Mirna commented on the bitter taste. Within seconds, her body stiffened. She began to convulse violently, foam spilling from her mouth. Her eyes rolled back as she slumped in her chair. Staff rushed over as Mirna fell to the floor, her body now racked with seizures. Bystanders attempted to help as Hani screamed for someone to call an ambulance. Witnesses later recalled Jessica remaining oddly calm while chaos unfolded around her. Cyanide works with brutal efficiency in the human body. It blocks cells from using oxygen, essentially suffocating every organ simultaneously. The brain, which requires constant oxygen, shuts down first. Death can occur within minutes. Paramedics arrived and found Mirna unresponsive, her pulse weak and irregular. They rushed her to Abdi Walio Hospital, where doctors fought to save her, but the poison had already caused irreversible damage. At 4:45 p.m., just under an hour after that first sip, Wayan Mirna Salihin was pronounced dead. Police analysis found 298 milligrams of cyanide in the coffee, enough to kill several adults. Investigators discovered Jessica had harbored a grudge against Mirna for criticizing her previous relationship. CCTV footage showed Jessica placing 3 shopping bags to block the cafe's security camera view of the table where Mirna's coffee waited. In October 2016, after a televised trial that captivated Indonesia, Jessica Kumala-Wongso was convicted of premeditated murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Birthday dinner that ended in silence. On September 13, 2021, Chris Russ celebrated his 57th birthday at an upscale steakhouse in Atlanta, Georgia. He was surrounded by friends and family, enjoying the evening he had looked forward to for weeks. Chris ordered his favorite, a thick-cut bison steak, rare. The restaurant was known for its generous portions and quality meat. The meal was going well, conversation flowed, glasses clinked in toast to another year of life. Then, mid-sentence, Chris stopped talking. His hand moved to his throat, the universal sign of choking. At first, those around him thought he might be coughing. Seconds later, his face began to turn red. A friend at the table realized what was happening and asked, "Are you choking?" Chris couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. A piece of bison steak, roughly the size of a golf ball, had become lodged in his windpipe, creating a complete blockage. One of his dinner companions immediately attempted the Heimlich maneuver. The abdominal thrust failed to dislodge the meat. Chris's face changed from red to purple as oxygen deprivation set in. A restaurant staff member trained in first aid tried next, also without success. Within 4 minutes without oxygen, brain cells begin to die. By the time paramedics arrived 6 minutes after the first signs of distress, Chris had collapsed and lost consciousness. They used specialized equipment to extract the meat, but the blockage had been in place too long. Chris was rushed to Grady Memorial Hospital in critical condition. Scans revealed severe hypoxic brain injury, damage caused by lack of oxygen. For 3 days, he remained on life support while his family maintained vigil. The birthday celebration that should have marked another year of life instead marked its end. On September 16th, doctors confirmed Chris Russ had no meaningful brain activity. His family made the painful decision to remove life support. What began as a simple bite of food had ended a life in less than a week. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as complications of asphyxia due to choking on food. Jelly that killed. On November 10, 2018, 67-year-old Edward Eddie Casson was admitted to Royal Bolton Hospital in England. He had a complex medical history including dysphagia, difficulty swallowing, and had previously suffered a stroke that further compromised his ability to safely consume certain foods. His medical notes clearly specified that he required a carefully textured diet and that jelly, a seemingly innocent dessert, posed a particular danger to him. 3 days after admission, a healthcare assistant served Eddie raspberry jelly for dessert. His medical chart, with its clear warnings about swallowing risks, had been overlooked. The jelly's unique texture, solid enough to hold shape but melting to liquid, made it especially dangerous for someone with Eddie's condition. Minutes after consuming the jelly, Eddie began to choke. The gelatinous substance slipped past his airway protection reflexes and entered his lungs, a process called aspiration. Unlike choking, which causes immediate symptoms, aspiration can initially seem less severe while setting a deadly process in motion. By the next morning, Eddie developed a fever of 38.5 degrees Celsius. His breathing became labored, with an elevated respiratory rate of 26 breaths per minute. X-rays revealed the beginnings of aspiration pneumonia, an infection caused when food particles introduce bacteria into the lungs. Despite being started on intravenous antibiotics, Eddie's condition deteriorated rapidly. Aspiration pneumonia is particularly dangerous because the foreign material creates an ideal breeding ground for bacteria. The body's immune response triggers inflammation, which floods the lungs with fluid, making oxygen exchange increasingly difficult. Within 48 hours, Eddie required supplemental oxygen as his blood oxygen levels dropped to 88%, well below the normal range of 95–100%. On November 15th, 5 days after the jelly was served, Eddie Casson suffered respiratory failure. His lungs could no longer deliver sufficient oxygen to his organs. At 3:47 p.m., he was pronounced dead. A subsequent coroner's inquest ruled that his death was contributed to by neglect, finding that hospital staff had failed to follow clearly documented dietary restrictions. A spoonful of jelly, meant to provide comfort, had instead delivered a death sentence. The lung that mushroom ate. On May 11, 2020, in rural South Korea, a previously healthy elderly man collected wild mushrooms from the mountainside near his home. The retired farmer often gathered seasonal vegetables and fungi to supplement his meals. That evening, he boiled the mushrooms and consumed them for dinner, unaware he had made a fatal identification error. 6 hours after his meal, the first symptoms appeared. Violent vomiting began suddenly, followed by profuse diarrhea. The man initially dismissed it as simple food poisoning that would pass. By morning, the gastrointestinal symptoms had become severe enough that his son drove him to a local hospital. Initial blood tests showed elevated liver enzymes, with ALT and AST levels over 5 times normal limits, indicating acute liver injury. Doctors suspected mushroom poisoning and began supportive treatments. What happened next baffled the medical team. Within 48 hours, the patient developed a persistent cough and increasing shortness of breath. A chest CT scan revealed something horrifying. The man's left lung showed extensive consolidation. Areas where the normally air-filled spaces had become filled with fluid. By the 4th day, the lung tissue had begun to necrotize, literally die and decompose inside his body. The toxin was destroying his lung cell by cell. The patient was transferred to a specialized toxicology unit in Seoul. By day 6, his oxygen levels had dropped so critically that he required intubation and mechanical ventilation. The left lung continued to deteriorate despite aggressive treatment. Tissue samples confirmed the presence of Podostroma cornudium toxins, one of the deadliest mushrooms in Asia. On day 9, surgeons performed an emergency pneumonectomy, complete removal of the left lung, as a desperate measure to prevent the spread of necrosis. The extracted lung was blackened, liquefied in areas, and barely recognizable as human tissue. The operation came too late. Multiple organ systems had already absorbed the toxin. The patient's remaining lung, liver, and kidneys began to fail simultaneously. Despite continuous dialysis and maximum life support measures, he died on day 13. The mushroom he had mistaken for an edible variety contained trichothecene mycotoxins, compounds so potent they had once been investigated as biological weapons. A date that turned fatal. On May 7, 2019, 23-year-old Allison Pickering agreed to a first date with a classmate at a trendy seafood restaurant in Boston. The senior at Boston University was just 3 days away from graduation, eagerly anticipating the environmental science career she had spent years preparing for. Allison had lived with a severe peanut allergy since childhood and always carried 2 EpiPens in her purse. When ordering, she did what she had done hundreds of times before, informed the server about her peanut allergy. She selected the mahi-mahi, a dish she had safely enjoyed at the same restaurant twice before. Unknown to Allison, the restaurant had recently updated their menu. The fish now came with a peanut-based sauce not mentioned in the description. Halfway through her meal, Allison felt the first warning sign, a tingling sensation in her lips. She put down her fork immediately and reached for her water glass. Within seconds, the tingling progressed to swelling. She calmly told her date she was having an allergic reaction and retrieved an EpiPen from her purse. Allison self-administered the epinephrine auto-injector, pressing it firmly against her outer thigh as she had been trained to do. The date called 911. Restaurant staff cleared a path to the entrance. Allison remained conscious and alert, even walking unassisted to meet the ambulance that had arrived within minutes. This false stability is common in severe allergic reactions. The EpiPen had temporarily slowed the reaction, but the allergen continued circulating through her system. In the ambulance, just 4 minutes after leaving the restaurant, Allison's blood pressure plummeted. Her airways, already narrowed by inflammation, began closing completely. Paramedics immediately administered a second epinephrine dose and intravenous antihistamines. They placed an oxygen mask over her face, but her oxygen saturation continued dropping. By the time they reached Massachusetts General Hospital, Allison was in full anaphylactic shock. Her heart had slowed to a dangerous rhythm. The emergency room team worked frantically, performing an emergency tracheotomy to bypass her swollen airways. Despite their efforts, Allison Pickering's heart stopped at 9:43 p.m. After 20 minutes of resuscitation attempts, she was pronounced dead. Her graduation gown would hang unworn, her future erased by a hidden ingredient in a restaurant meal she thought was safe. The leftover Bonalu feast. On July 17, 2018, the Bonalu festival brought vibrant celebrations to the streets of Hyderabad, India. The annual Hindu festival honored the goddess Mahakali with elaborate offerings of food and rituals. 46-year-old Srinivas Yadav, a local shopkeeper, participated in the festivities with his extended family, preparing traditional dishes including mutton, chicken, and specially prepared goat intestines. The celebration continued late into the night. When it ended, leftover food was packed away. The temperature that night remained above 30 degrees Celsius. Dangerously warm for storing meat. The following day, at lunch, Srinivas and 3 relatives reheated and consumed the leftover feast. The meat had been refrigerated briefly, then sat at room temperature for hours before being warmed again. Perfect conditions for bacterial growth. Just 4 hours later, Srinivas experienced severe abdominal cramps. The pain came in waves, doubling him over. Soon after, violent vomiting began, followed by profuse watery diarrhea. His relatives, 2 brothers-in-law and a nephew, developed similar symptoms. By evening, all 4 men were severely dehydrated. Srinivas's condition deteriorated faster than the others. His vomiting became tinged with blood. His skin turned cold and clammy as his blood pressure dropped. Family members rushed all 4 men to Gandhi Hospital around midnight, with Srinivas barely conscious upon arrival. Medical tests revealed Bacillus cereus food poisoning, a particularly aggressive form that produces 2 distinct toxins. One causes vomiting by directly attacking the stomach lining. The other produces a toxin that remains stable even through reheating and triggers dangerous intestinal inflammation. By morning, Srinivas had lost over 12% of his body's fluid volume. His kidneys began to fail as they struggled to process the bacterial toxins. His heart rate climbed to 160 beats per minute as his body fought to maintain blood pressure. Despite aggressive IV fluid replacement and antibiotics, his organs continued shutting down one by one. At 6:17 the next morning, less than 18 hours after consuming the meal, Srinivas Yadav went into cardiac arrest. Resuscitation attempts failed. The other 3 men survived after several days of intensive treatment. Health officials later confirmed that improper storage between serving and reheating had allowed bacteria to multiply to lethal levels in the festival food. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.